You might say
Also there.
Because those are going to come in. That's
You
not
never
my
know.
account too.
Well, if I get $1 million out of the deal, I'll
All right, everybody, welcome. We're going to get started here. I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. I am Pastor Parnell.Mahoney. We are Maranatha Christian Fellowship and International Student Outreach hosting this event tonight. And I'm a campus minister here. And tonight's presentation, if you come to the right place, is Biological Proofs of Evolution Fail. The Evidence Cries Out Designed. And it's part of the Was Darwin Wrong series. So we're excited that you guys came tonight. And we will have more of the part 2, part 3 in the coming nights here. Same time, same place, 7 o'clock tomorrow and 7 o'clock on Friday night. New topic each night. And also at our church, we have services. We worship on Saturday night at our campus church house. We have a house church on the edge of campus. So that's going to be 7 o'clock on Saturday night. So we have four parts to this series, which we're excited about. You're welcome to come to each one. We have a table over here that you're welcome to grab anything on that table you're interested in. And we have some free Christian materials on different subjects. And we have a sign-up sheet where you can learn more about our events. We have our activities and things like that. You can grab some information. We have the flyers for this event on that table. If you didn't get a flyer for this event and you want to know more details about the upcoming presentations, please grab one or grab one for a friend. So why are we doing this presentation tonight? How's the sound? First of all, does the sound good to you guys? Okay, awesome. Awesome. So I'm going to start to answer that question, I'm going to start by telling my story. And I was a college student here. I'm alumni long ago. Graduated in 2000 and got my degree in fisheries and wildlife here at the university. And when I was a junior, I did not have any kind of faith background. So I'd call myself an agnostic. And around my junior year, I began to have questions. So why am I here? Am I just an accident? I'm kind of putting the pieces together. I was kind of brought up with a kind of naturalistic worldview that the material world is all that is really exists. But in my heart, in my soul, I began to say, is there more? And so I met a minister on campus, and he invited me to do Bible study. And I was maybe dumb enough to let him into my apartment. And he started bringing me coffee, got me addicted to Starbucks. Actually, I drink Caribou now, or home brew. That's much cheaper. But anyhow, he'd come over to my apartment every Friday night, and we would study the Bible together, or at least he would preach to me out of the Bible. And I was from California, just a city kid. And so I just kind of nodded my head and kind of listened to him. And I didn't reject it because it gave me hope. I thought this was a pretty profound message. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. But is it true? So then I met Jesus in my apartment one night on campus, down past Dinkytown on the way over to Van Cleve Park. I was in my apartment one night, and I met him. He came and revealed himself to me, and kind of brought me through this process of repentance, turning from my sin, confessing my sin to God. And then he showed me where my sin would take me, separated from him forever. And so that night, he reminded me of what I had learned in the Bible study, that Jesus died for my sins and rose from the dead. And if I accepted him and made him my Lord, I could be saved. And so that's what I did that night. I said, all right, you got a deal. If you'll forgive me, I'll follow you forever. And so I got born again that night. I believe I got born again. That's what Jesus called it. And that means that you go to heaven if you get born again. That's what Jesus said in John 3. So suddenly my life changed. My heart changed. And all of a sudden there was a voice inside of me that was directing me on what was good and what was wrong and who God was. And everything became brand new. And that's just what Jesus said happens to believers in him. And so that happened to me. And I felt whole. I knew the greatest love for the first time that I'd never experienced before. And it was amazing. So then, hey, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time, hopefully.
Yeah.
Sorry to She came an hour early, so I was just making sure that everything was all right. So then I'm almost done here, and then we'll get started. Then, it was through the Bible that I met Jesus. So, okay, the Bible is my paradigm now. That's how I judge everything. And at church, they said, evolution is not in the Bible. And I was like, what? So I was a science major here. So they kind of challenged me. I saw Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And I thought, all right, I'll switch then. And I became an outcast right at that moment. And then, so I said, all right, God, I switched, but you got to give me some supporting evidence. So, anyhow, we see that in the Bible that it teaches special creation, right? 6 days, supernatural event. God created everything in this whole universe, this world, all life in 6 days. And so that's the paradigm that I was coming from. And so just a few things about that, logically speaking, for people that want to kind of trust in the Bible. On the third day of creation in chapter 1, it says that God put the lights in the sky, like the stars, the planets, the sun, and the moon. And he says specifically for signs and seasons and days and years. And also in that creation week, we know he made the plants and the animals at that time, right? So then God formed man and woman at the end. And they probably looked about 20 years old, right? Because he said, be fruitful and multiply. So they weren't little babies, There was no one nursing them. And yet they were probably minutes old. So they looked probably about 20 minutes old, right? And then immediately they could see what? They could see the stars. They could see the sun and the moon because it was for signs and seasons and days and years. So immediately they could enjoy the plants and animals that God supernaturally created just in that special creation. And so God operated in creation week under not a naturalistic paradigm that we operate in now, but in a supernatural paradigm. So as Christians and creationists, he's getting the door. If we're looking for naturalistic explanations to the origins of life and the created kinds of animals and plants, etc., if we're looking for naturalistic explanations, meaning nature's all there is, we have to have a naturalistic explanation, we're going to have to ignore evidence to the contrary. And so that's where we're coming from. And so tonight we hope to begin making a compelling case to you against the grand story of evolution, not necessarily microevolution, but the grand story, molecules to man, and a compelling case for special creation. So that's now I'm getting off my soapbox now, okay? So the presentation tonight is going to be about an hour and 15 minutes, although I know that's hard for them. Dave and Mary Jo are excited about their information. They would much rather have 90 minutes. So it seems like some of their points they're skipping over something, it's because I put pressure on them. Just remember that. If you have more questions, talk to them after. A little bit about them. Also there's a Q&A after. So if you stay for the Q&A, we'll take questions and they'll answer those. Dave is from Grand Junction, Colorado, and he likes hiking and is an avid fly fisherman, likes catching trout up in those mountain lakes. And Mary Jo is from Mankato, Minnesota, and she enjoys time with her grandkids. And both of them are former evolutionists who have carefully studied the scientific issues and have become convinced of the truth of creation. They are founders and directors of Alpha Omega Institute and have begun teaching creation science over 40 years ago and have been doing so ever since. They have advanced degrees in mathematics for Dave and geology for Dave, and Mary Jo with biology with a science education emphasis. They've both taught at the high school and the college level. And these presentations are being streamed tonight on YouTube, and we're going to possibly switch to Zoom the next couple nights. But we have a QR code on our flyers on the table that you can scan with your phone, and it'll take you right to one or the other, whichever ones we're streaming, and they'll be recorded there too for future reference. So without further ado, please welcome the Nuttings, Dave and Mary Jo Nutting.
Well, thank you. We're good to be back with you. We've been coming to this campus for, I don't know, 15 years or more, I guess now. And it's always good to be back. Tonight, we're going to be looking at biology. And then tomorrow, Dave will be looking at fossils. And on Friday night, we'll look at geology. So that's kind of what's coming up. I'm trained as a biologist. I was taught all through my education that evolution is true, and I believed it. Now, I did grow up in a church background, and I believed that too. And for a while, what I did was just put a big line down the middle. I said, okay, creation is a religious explanation, evolution is scientific explanation. But as we were studying later on, upon a little book that started us doing research. It was called Evolution, the Fossils Say No. And I bought that book for 5 cents in a secondhand store. It didn't convince us, but what it did do was make us question what we had been taught and begin to do our own research. And so that's all we want to encourage you tonight. If this is new to you, welcome. If you've never heard it before, you're really welcome to be here tonight. We'll be glad to take your questions later. But we just would encourage you, listen and open your mind to say, what if? What if this is really true, what we're talking about tonight? And take a look at it from that perspective. We do believe that as we have studied the evidence, scientific evidence, that is in good support of what the Bible teaches about creation. And so, we're coming from that point of view. But when we switched from evolution to creation, we did it on the basis of science. Later on, we looked at the Bible. We said, how in the world did we ever think the Bible taught evolution? But when we first made that switch, it was on the basis of science. And so we want to encourage you along that line tonight. Some of you are science majors, I know, and coming from a variety of backgrounds. So you're very familiar with the evolutionary model, because that's all that's usually taught in the schools from kindergarten on up. I mean, starting with dinosaurs, start getting evolution. And so what you hear tonight might sound crazy to you at first. And if that's the case, that's okay. Just we're asking, keep an open mind and take a look at what we're seeing. Really, when we look at the origin of life and the origin of the universe and the various kinds of living things on this planet, there's really only two main models. I mean, either humans were created as humans, or we came about from what? We like to call it the goo to you by way of the zoo. If we came about by evolution, naturalistically, without a supernatural creator, then we should be able to see evidence of that in the fossil record and in the living world. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. A lot of people think that evolution is science, but creation is just a religious myth. I was taught that. Actually, I was taught that in a church college, that creation's just a myth. It's just a story. They told me it was for primitive people who couldn't understand the science of evolution. Well, I thought that was a good solution for a while, but as I really started digging into the science myself, I went, no, evolution is not really science. It's a belief. It's an interpretation of evidence, and it's a belief system about the past. Just like creation, if you believe in creation, it's a belief. Okay, we're not trying to tell you we can prove creation. We cannot prove creation scientifically, but neither can anyone prove evolution scientifically. It's an interpretation of the data that we see. Evolution is very consistent with the naturalistic explanation, which means that we can explain everything in the universe without God, without a supernatural creator at all. But this is a philosophical position. It's not really a directly scientific position. And so evolutionary naturalism is what's taught in the schools all around this nation and around the world. Actually, we've been around the world in various countries, and we see evolution being taught all over the place. It's not just in schools, it's in the museums, it's in the textbooks, it's on TV shows, and it is an interpretive framework through which people look at the evidence. And so they try to explain everything through that. Well, tonight, we want to encourage you, thinking is allowed, okay? And questions are allowed. And so we'll take those questions at the end. Question might be, how does your worldview impact the way that you look at science? Now, a worldview is basically a sum total of what you've been taught over the years. How do we get a worldview? Well, we pick it up in school and from our families and from what we watch and from our friends. What do we listen to? A worldview is, you could say, it colors your view of the world. So if I was to give you a pair of red glasses and you looked at a white wall, that wall would look red, right? If you had blue glasses, it would look blue. If all you ever heard for your whole schooling was it said evolution across the front, you're going to learn to interpret the scientific data through the lens of evolution. Now, you could say the same thing if the only thing you heard was creation, then you would learn to interpret that way, wouldn't you? But what Parnell did and what we have done is to look at that evidence from both sides. We've looked at it from the evolutionary point of view. We've also looked at it from a creation point of view. And we came to the conclusion when we were studying that the creation model made more sense scientifically than the evolution model. And so that's what we're going to be sharing some of that with you tonight. Now, your worldview will impact your interpretation of the data. And you think about it, the data should be the same whether you believe in evolution or creation, shouldn't it? I mean, if I had a rock here, it doesn't matter if you're an evolutionist or a creationist. You could weigh that rock, you could measure it, you could grind it up and figure out what chemicals make it up, right? And so that rock is a rock regardless of if you're an evolutionist or a creationist. Now, if we start saying, well, I believe this rock was laid down how many million years ago, and we have evidence of that, we think, we can't prove that. And so then we're in the area of interpretation instead of in the area of looking and actually doing the data. That's why you can have two perfectly good scientists looking at the very same evidence, and one will say, wow, isn't evolution wonderful? And the other goes, what an awesome creator we have. If you're looking at the same data, your worldview will impact how you look at that data. Tonight, when we look at biology, we're going to be grouping this evidence in 4 basic categories. And I do that simply because there's so much evidence out there. We could come up with all kinds of different things that might be disputed, might be accepted. But when we look at it, change and similarity and junk and imperfection, we're going to be going there tonight in those 4 categories. We'll start with change, because what does evolution mean? The word simply means change. So how many of you believe in change? We all do, don't we? So we better ask some more questions. The other questions are, how much change are we talking about, and what kind of change are we talking about? Are we talking about what we might call mega evolution, which goes from molecules to human beings? That's a major changes, right? And that can, a lot of times, even this mega evolution or cosmic evolution can include the Big Bang and the origin of the universe and how did we get life in the beginning and so on. So mega evolution, the great big overarching idea of evolution. Or we might say macroevolution, which we define at least as the origin of new types, new body types, and so on. So fish changing to amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to mammals, and so on, all the way up to human beings. That might be called mega evolution. Or are we talking simply about variation within a kind? So we got a lot of dogs, and yet they're still dogs. We can have a whole variety, lots of them, right? Big dogs, little dogs, Chihuahuas, St. Bernards, Dalmatians. And whenever dogs mate, they have puppies. They don't have kittens. They don't change into anything else. And so we would say that that's an illustration of this kind of change within a kind. Now, we know that results from genetics and genetic recombination of genes and so on. We understand that from Mendel's work, which many years ago, and then everything that's been built on it since. Darwin didn't know about that, though, when he was around. Mendel's work hadn't been published yet when Darwin published his famous book. And so Darwin was trying to explain, how do we get variations and how do we save the good ones? Why do we have certain things that survive and other things that don't? He took a lot of examples from what we might call artificial selection, which is when human beings are involved also in the selection process of saving certain character qualities or traits within organisms. But then he tried to go beyond what he had actually observed to say, oh, well, that must be how we got all of the living creatures then. So we could look at it from our perspective. We look at this kind of variation and we call it variation, but it's not evidence of mega or macro evolution. You might want to call it microevolution. And, you know, at that level, we're open to talk about that because there are changes that take place. But the question is, what is the role of mutation and natural selection in coming up with these new characteristics? And we'll be talking about that a little bit. Some of the common evidences of evolution. These are the kinds of things that the textbooks, especially, you know, in the high school level or in the early college levels, this is the kind of evidence people will look at. Things like Darwin's finches, antibiotic resistant bacteria, you know, and the peppered moth, that's a famous one. We look at those things and we say, yes, there is variation, but it doesn't the kind of variation we need to explain evolution. So, for example, finches. Charles Darwin went on his famous voyage around the world and came to the Galapagos Islands. And when he was there, he saw the variation in these finches. He supposed that they had flown over from South America originally, and that that variation had taken place over time, long periods of time. And now we see all the differences in the types of finches. Well, that's good evidence, isn't it? It does give us evidence that things change. But the question that we have is, how much change is involved? And what kind of change is involved? What do we start with here? We start with finches. And what do we end up with? Finches, different sizes and shapes of beaks, some changes in their body types, some changes in what their preferred types of foods are, but they're still finches. So nothing fundamentally new. And that's the point we want to make here. It's not something fundamentally new. Now, it's very interesting that further research that's been done on these finches, and what it's showing is that it seems these changes in beak structure seems to vary over time with changes in the environment. So if they're very wet years, there's a predominance maybe of birds that eat one kind of food, and if it's very dry years, they need a different kind of beak to get through the very dry and hard seeds. And so we see that's been happening. I wonder about how much these changes are due to what's called epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is something relatively new in the study of genetics. You have your DNA molecules, but then you have molecules or substances that are attached to the DNA molecules, which will turn on and turn off various parts of DNA and help that organism to adapt to an environment. I'm really excited about what's coming out in epigenetics because I think, again, it just shows evidence of design, and it's phenomenal. Here's a quote about changes in Darwin's finches. And this is Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. He says, scientists have discovered that the genes are very similar among the various species of these finches. They discovered that epigenetics correlated closely with beak shape and size among the species. Epigenetic mechanisms clearly remain a major player in adaptation. Where are we going to go with that? I think that kind of research is going to be expanding more and more because it always kind of, I was always a little bit confused by it. You know, you got the DNA and that's great, phenomenal, exciting molecules, protein synthesis, very complex system. But I always wondered, how can this order that we see on the DNA molecule how does that help an organism change and adapt to differing environmental conditions? And epigenetics seems to be an answer for that. And so I'm interested in watching that in the coming years to see exactly how that it is impacted. One of the most classic evidences of natural selection was the peppered moth. And the idea was that before the Industrial Revolution, there were moths around. There were more light moths, they said, than dark moths because the light ones were better camouflaged on the trees than the dark ones were. And then they started burning coal and polluted the air, and the tree bark became darkened with soot. And they said over time, there were more dark moths than light ones. And that has become a classic evidence of natural selection. And then usually the book will say something about natural selection is how evolution takes place. Well, let's take a look at that a little bit. What do we start out with here? We start out with moths, light ones and dark ones. And what do we end up with? Light ones and dark ones. The only thing that we see difference is a little bit of change in the numbers. At least that's what we're told. But if we look a little more closely, we find out there's nothing fundamentally new here. And this whole story of the peppered moths may be bogus, because when they went back, they could not verify that these moths even were resting on the trunks of the trees. In fact, the guys that originally did this had to stick those moths onto the bark of the tree to get the pictures. They would normally rest up in the leaves, and they fly around at night, and so you don't see them in the daytime, and then they're just hiding in the leaves of the trees. So this whole thing may be a bogus example. And yet how many students over the years have been taught this proves evolution? Now, we're not against the idea of natural selection, but is this really a good example? Well, Jonathan Wells back in 2002 wrote a book exposing the myths of this peppered moths. And then later on, the Journal of Evolutionary Biology, September 2012, confirmed what Jonathan Wells was teaching. And this is in a section called Evolution News. But what were they saying? They're saying there's nothing really new. If we wanted to be able to demonstrate evolution, we really need to show how we get new genetic information. How do we get new traits appearing? This does not speak to that at all, because we had both kinds to start with. So that doesn't really fit. What about antibiotic resistant bacteria? And, we've been talking about the pandemic and all, and the new mutations coming about the virus there, right? Well, yes, we can observe mutations, and we can observe that some things survive, but is that evolution? Only if you define evolution that way, right? But does it distinguish between the evolutionary model and the creation model? Well, I don't think it does, because when you look at these bacteria, what do you find out? You start out with bacteria. What do you end up with? Bacteria, the same fundamental types of bacteria. There's nothing fundamentally new here. And so, again, variation within a type, but not from one kind of thing to another kind of thing. So we would say variation, yes, but not the kind of evidence we need to demonstrate macro or mega evolution. Variations. What about the races? The origin of the races. Charles Darwin thought that the races of human beings had come from differing kinds of apes and monkeys in the past. And that over time, these differing streams, you might say, evolved at different rates, so that some races were more advanced than other races. In fact, what's the subtitle on his book? You remember it? It's called On the Origin of Species.
Preservation of favored races.
Preservation of favored races. And that's not politically correct to talk that way today, right? I mean, we get in trouble if we talk about favored races. And yet, that's what Darwin's theory was about. And that's what he was proposing, that the races had come from a variety of different lines of apes and monkeys. Well, we know today what Darwin did not know, he knew nothing about Mendelian genetics. And today we can show that if you have two parents with skin color, medium skin color, and they have children, you could get all the way from darkest dark to lightest light in one generation, one family, if you start, and this is the caution here, if you start with the parents of medium skin color and that right combination of genes. Now we're not told that in the biology books usually, and yet this is very easy to demonstrate using the Punnett square that's typically used in genetics classes. And so we can show you that even in living creatures. Here's one family, and look at this. They have medium skinned colored parents, and look at the kids. Those are twins. They look very, very different, don't they? Different combination of genes there. Here's as they grow. Here's another article that was in Science magazine a few years ago, How Africans Evolved a Palette of Skin Tones, it says. And here's a quote from there. It says, researchers agree that our early Australopithecine ancestors in Africa probably had light skin beneath hairy pelts. Question, how do they know that? What's the evidence? I mean, how we should be asking students, you should be asking, how do they know that? You know, they're just assuming here, aren't they? That one of the researchers, Tishkoff, says Tishkoff's team found that the story of skin color evolution isn't so black and white. And what they were finding was there's not a good pattern to follow. The study adds to established research, undercutting old notions of race. And then they say you can't use skin color to classify humans. We'll get your questions later, so jot it down, please, okay? There is so much diversity in Africans that there is no such thing as an African race, is what the researchers were saying. Now, think about it. We classify people that way, right? According to races, but we are all humans and we are all related. And so really there's only one human race, but a lot of variation in skin tones and so on. And that can be explained from a biblical account of what was called the Tower of Babel, where God had created human beings. They had a variety of skin colors and skin tones, but then God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, spread out. And this was after the time of Noah's flood. But as they were to spread out, they didn't want to spread out. So God confused the languages, forcing the spreading out. And then we can see how we could easily get various colored skin and other characteristics we might associate with race that could be cemented in smaller populations as they spread out. So that's a simplistic explanation. It's much more complicated than this. There's many more factors involved. But at the base level, this is what you see from Mendelian genetics. Here's another question for you. According to evolution, how do you get new genetic information? Because this is really the crux of the matter. If we're going to go from a single-celled organism, or actually they say just from random chemicals getting together, how do we produce the multitudes and multitudes of various characteristics that we see within the living world? Where do we get all this variation? How does it come about? And usually what they will tell us is it comes about by mutation and selection. But Darwin didn't know that. During Darwin's day, they thought that you could get things coming about by what Lamarck called the inheritance of acquired traits. Well, that has been fairly well disproved, at least on an overall level. And so most people don't believe that anymore today. But that's why they bring in what's called neo-Darwinian evolution, just meaning new. And what they did to come up with neo-Darwinian was they combined the idea of mutation with Darwin's idea of natural selection. And they said mutation plus natural selection is how evolution takes place. That's very well accepted. That's the primary method that people believe in, at least for evolution to take place. Couple of problems with that, though. You think about it, neither mutation nor natural selection can create anything. I mean, if you're going to mutate the DNA, you got to have DNA to start with. And mutation doesn't work just on random chemicals. Something's got to be able to reproduce, or else that mutation is not good at all. And natural selection, can it create anything? Can't. All it can do is select, right? If I offered you orange juice and apple juice, you can't get grape juice out of that, right? It can't create anything. It's a selective mechanism for something that's already there. So that's one of the problems with this. But then the next question becomes, what do we observe about mutations? Because after all, science, the base level of science is observation, experimentation, right? We're going to observe the real world. And what do we find out when we observe the real world? We find out mutations produce things like two-headed snakes and cattle with extra legs and roosters without any feathers and all sorts of fruit flies. If you've ever taken a genetics class or walked into the biology building, there's always fruit flies flying around that escaped from the genetics lab, right? But what do you find? You find flies with no wings and flies with curly wings and different shapes and sizes on their bodies and all different variations. That one there has 4 wings. Is that a better one? Well, not really. It couldn't fly, so it would have been eliminated, right? But lots and lots of mutation, and then they're selected by natural selection. So when we observe things, what do we really see? We see the observed results of mutation result in duplication of information. So, okay, you can get a fly with 4 wings instead of 2, but that information is just duplicating that ability to make wings, isn't it? You can get loss of information, flies with no wings. You can get deregulation of genetic information, like happens in cancer cells and so on. Or you can get aging and you can get death. You can get all sorts of things happening because of mutation. And that's what we observe in nature. If we really thought mutations were helpful and they were going to drive evolution, why not do more nuclear testing and increase the mutational rate, right? So maybe we could get something better, but obviously none of us do that. Well, that's just kind of on a general level where we all know that. But what about at a molecular level? Dr. John Sanford is a genetic researcher. He was with Cornell University, and he wrote this book called Genetic Entropy. Now, entropy is a measure of disorder, okay? And so what he's saying is bad mutations are going to mount up faster than natural selection can weed them out. And he goes through lots of mathematical calculations and observations of the real world to look at mutation plus natural selection as a method by which we can get new and better kinds of creatures. Well, does it work? You know, does this work? Well, he looked at it from his perspective. When he started his research, he was an evolutionist. He believed in evolution by mutation and natural selection. And I mean, this guy's a whole lot smarter than I am. So I like to quote him because he's done the research. He's a genetic researcher. He's published lots of scientific articles in peer-reviewed magazines and so on, journals. He was the co-inventor of the gene gun process by which they were able to sequence the DNA molecule. And so, you know, he's no slouch of a scientist. He really knows it. But what his research showed him was that you couldn't advance the species by mutation plus natural selection. He says this, mutational entropy, or what he's saying is the degradation of the genetic code because of mistakes and accidents coming in. And so he's saying this kind of mutational entropy appears to be so strong, especially in large genomes, that selection, natural selection, would not be able to reverse it. He said it is now clear that mutation and selection cannot stop the loss of genomic information. So mutation and selection clearly could not create anything in the first place, right? Careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals that the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. And he calls the primary axiom mutation plus natural selection equals evolution. He's saying it's wrong as the basis of his research. Then he says this: if mutation and selection cannot preserve the degeneration or prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. It's not just implausible. Listen to these words: not just implausible, not just unlikely, it's absolutely dead wrong. It is not just a false axiom, it's an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. So next time you're taught mutation plus natural selection is the driving mechanism of evolution, you can confidently reject that. Now, he's not rejecting it on the basis of any kind of religious belief. He's rejecting it on the basis of scientific observation. And if you're interested in that, we have, I guess you'll have to get it from our website, but there's a book that's called, well, the one you see here, Genetic Entropy. Excellent book. So mechanisms for evolution, mutation, natural selection, we can confidently say, no, these kinds of things cannot explain the origin of new kinds of living things. They might be, they actually happen and we can observe it, but they're not sufficient to explain how we can go against this disordering that comes about by accidents and chance. So we couldn't have created life in the first place. But that's the question, isn't it? If that's the case, where did life come from in the first place? And we're oftentimes told, oh, creationists, you just believe in faith and God and whatever, it's just religion. But they tell us evolution is science. Is it really? I mean, who has observed the origin of life? Who was there millions and millions and millions of years ago to observe life coming into existence by evolution? No one was there. We have no direct evidence of it. The only thing that they can say is we're here now, so we must have evolved. It must have happened sometime in the past, but that's not science. That's looking back, and that's evolutionary speculation. Speculation, okay, it has a place in creating hypotheses and research studies, but it is really not the best method of trying to demonstrate something scientifically. What about the other option? The other option says life comes from pre-existing life. One of the basic things you learn right away in biology, isn't it? Life comes only from life. You don't get living things from non-living molecules. Nobody has ever demonstrated in the laboratory. And yes, there are some experiments where they say they demonstrated it, but they were getting some very basic amino acids and so on. Problems with those, we could talk about those if you want, but the problems with some of those experiments was they came up with the wrong kinds of amino acids, and they came up with amino acids that would react with sugars and other things that just tie each other up. And so in their experiments, they had to introduce a trap into their system to get the things out of the atmosphere, because they would be broken down at a rate faster than they're produced. So the experiments you hear about, they really haven't demonstrated the origin of any kind of life at all. It's just speculation. And here's a quote from Franklin Harold. He says, "We must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." But what does he say right before he said that? He says, we should reject as a matter of principle the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. So what is he saying? We're going to reject anything that would point to a creator, anything that would point to intelligence being involved in the design of life. Reject it as a matter of principle, he says. What's he leaning on? He's leaning on this idea that science is the same thing as naturalism, but naturalism is not science. It's a philosophy. It's a belief system, just like supernaturalism is a belief. We can't prove that there's a supernatural, and we can't prove that everything came about naturally, according to science. You're going to come to a place where you have to say, well, I believe this is what happened. So when it comes to change by mutation and natural selection, we can just say, no, that's not sufficient to explain the origin of new types of living things. What about the idea of similarity? The second one on our list there. Similarity is just this idea that, oh, when we look at the forelimb of various kinds of creatures, we can see some similarities there. And usually the way that's taught is to say that indicates common ancestry. Well, is that a good explanation? Sometimes similarity comes because of common ancestry, right? See kids in the same family, oftentimes you see some similarities that came from the same parents. Sometimes similarity is a good explanation, but is it the only explanation for similarity? I think there's some other good explanations. I mean, one is maybe they were designed for a similar function. Variation on a theme. The chair you're sitting on is similar to the seat in your automobile or a bus seat or something, but they have differences because they're made for specific purposes, don't they? So variation on a theme is another idea. Maybe they're similar because they were designed by the same designer. Much as if you went into an art museum, you could pick out the Rembrandts according to the style and the use of color and the things that make that style of painting specific to him. And so that might be another reason why things are similar. And then finally, this one, I really think this is important. That things were designed to work together. We live in an ecosystem and in a universe. There's only so many chemicals in this universe, so many elements, and they need to be combined in various ways. We need to eat the plants, so we better have some similarity in the way the body system and so on. We eat basically the same kinds of food as apes and monkeys, right? Basically the same. Wouldn't you expect some basic similar chemistry? And yes, indeed, we would. So, there's the point of that is there's more than one way to explain similarity. And yet you see things like this in the book, and they'll say, look, you had gill slits and a yolk sac and a tail when you were about 2 months in development. Well, two things about the gill slits: they're not slits and they're not gills. So why would they call them gill slits? Except they're trying to remind you of the similarity between the human embryo and fish. Well, is it really so similar? Not so much as what they want to tell you. Those little things that they call slits are not slits, they're little pouches. They're called pharyngeal pouches. They develop in the structure of the neck and the jaw region. Very important in humans. And yes, in fish, there's something that looks a little similar. It develops into gills, but we don't have gills. We don't need gills. Yolk sac, do humans need yolk? No, that little sac forms the blood cells for the baby until it's big enough to make the blood in the bones and so on. What they call his tail looks like a tail, doesn't it? In this stage, it grows a little more quickly than the rest of that little baby. But as it grows, it stimulates the growth of the legs, and later on, it's just enclosed in your body. It's called the end of your spinal column, right? It's got to end someplace, and it just grew a little more quickly here. But notice the terminology that's used to specify these things has a built-in evolutionary bias, doesn't it? In the terminology that's used in so many textbooks, and yet these things are not what they say they are. Back in the late 1800s, Ernst Haeckel was a strong proponent of Darwinian evolution. He came up with this idea of the biogenetic law, and he drew these diagrams to show how similar the embryos of various creatures are. He's got the fish, the salamander, and so on, all the way up to humans here. And they look really similar, don't they, if you look at the top row? But he fudged the diagrams. They're not nearly as similar as what there are in his diagrams. He was called before a board of scientific examiners, and they chastised him and said, no, you can't do that. It's not good evidence. And so this whole idea is really defunct, but it's still taught in museums, and we've seen it in textbooks in recent years. It should have been eliminated many, many years ago. Because, I mean, you think about it, science is always changing, isn't it? It's progressing because we learn new things. But what happens is when some of this stuff gets in the books and museums, it never gets out. If it is pointing to the accepted paradigm of evolutionary humanism or evolutionary naturalism. So bad evidence. The one they're using a lot today is called biochemical homology, and that's based on the order of the nucleotides in the DNA molecule or in the RNA molecule or the order of the amino acids in proteins. And the idea is the closer related we are, according to the Darwinian theory, the closer those biochemicals are going to be in structure. Well, from that, they go, and even in popular magazines, here's Time magazine, said the claim was chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. First question should be, how do we know that? Is that even true? And then secondly, even if it is true, does that mean we had a common ancestor? Doesn't prove that. It could have been common, that could have been the similarity because of design by an intelligent creator. Or it could be there because of common ancestry. How would we know the difference? Well, more research has been done, and they see this number going down and down and down. This one, it says the evolutionary sprint made us human. 6.4% of the 22,000 odd human genes aren't present in chimps, making the gap between the two seem much wider. And that's down to 93% there. And then Dr. Tompkins says 86 to 89% similarity is conservative. It looks like it may be as low as 70%. Well, that's a big difference. 99%, 70%. You can read more about that in the book Replacing Darwin, the new origin of species. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, he's a Harvard graduate, isn't he, I believe? But he's been doing research in this area, and he's got an alternative idea why these things might be similar. But even if it was true, the mouse, according to some people, is 97% similar to human beings. So maybe we came from mice instead of from apes and monkeys, huh? Zebrafish, 92%, and I like this one, bananas, 50%. Maybe we came from bananas. What do you do with this kind of stuff? Well, first of all, if there's only 4 bases in the DNA molecule, you would expect they're going to have 1 out of 4 at least should be the same, right? And so you can see that, but it really means nothing. Here's a book was printed back in 1985. Way back then, Michael Denton was saying, by the way, Denton is a molecular biologist. He was not a creationist at the time. I don't think he's still a creationist. He's a proponent of intelligent design now. But back then he said this, the really significant finding that comes to light comparing proteins, amino acid sequences, is that it is impossible to arrange them in any sort of an evolutionary series. He knew that back then. And then since then, Michael Lynch said this clarification of the phylogenetic, that just means the evolutionary relationships of the major animal phyla, has been an elusive problem with analyses based on different genes and different analyses based on the same genes, yielding a diversity of evolutionary trees. So, you see these nice tree of life, right? That's in the textbooks and museums and so on. But it depends on which biochemical you're using, which one you come up with, and sometimes even from the same ones. New Scientist magazine published this article a while back. It was called Darwin Was Wrong. It says right at the front. And in that article, there was a sketch, Darwin's sketch of an evolutionary tree of life. Look at that. What does he say? I think. He sketched that out in his journal. It was just an idea. He didn't have proof of it. It was just, okay, I think this might be what we're seeing. Well, since then, it's become entrenched in biology. And in this article, in New Scientist says, for a long time, the holy grail was to build a tree of life. A few years ago, that grail was within reach, but today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. And what was the evidence they cited in the article? It was the findings on DNA. The more that we learn about DNA, the more that we know that this is not so simple. The tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, turned out to be a figment of our imagination. Now, again, what is science based on? Observation, experimentation. And here they're saying it's just a figment of imagination, and yet it's taught in the books as if it's science, as if it's a well-supported scientific theory, at least, if not a fact. And oftentimes they present it as if it's fact, even though they might call it a theory. Then they said this: we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. Wait a minute, I thought it was, looking at textbooks, right? They don't say, hey, this is a theory, we think this might be. They present it to students as if it's true. And then here was their conclusion: biology is vastly more complex than we thought. And facing up to this complexity will be scary. Well, coming at it from a creationist point of view, I don't find it scary at all. I find it really, really exciting that the more that we're learning scientifically, the more we're learning about the complexity of living systems. And the more that it just is mounting evidence to say it could never have happened by chance and accident. Now, if you want to believe it happened by chance and accident, that's fine, but don't call it science then. Just call it your belief system. So this tree of life is coming down, being cut down right down there by science itself. And so when we look at the idea of similarity, we can just say no. And you can look at lots of other things along in that way too. What about junk? What do we mean by junk? Junk is supposed leftovers, vestigial organs, useless leftovers. At one point, they had a list of 180 different things in the human body they said were leftover from evolution, that they have no function today, or that they had vestiges of that function. And so they said these things were evidence of evolution. But on that list, they had the pituitary gland. What's the pituitary gland do? We know now pituitary gland is often called the master gland of the body, involved in the regulation of all the hormones and various other kinds of systems in the body. It's not a leftover, a useless leftover. Thymus, tonsils, appendix on that list. We know now that they're all involved in immunity. And yes, the appendix too, they're finding has a function. It's not a useless leftover. Wisdom teeth, do they have a function? Yeah, they do. Just like the rest of the teeth, they're used in chewing, right? Now, sometimes in development, a baby will, or a child will, go along and the mouth doesn't develop large enough for those wisdom teeth to come in properly, and they may become impacted, and you may have to remove them. But does that mean they did not have a purpose to start with? Not at all. Just because something could go wrong with it. I mean, something could go wrong with your heart too. Does that mean your heart has no function? Not at all. And so, you look at these kinds of things, and we would predict they have function. When they first sequenced the DNA molecule, they said 99% of this molecule is junk. And we went, or excuse me, not 99, 97 to 98% is what they said. And I said back then, go back to the lab, let's do more research, because we predict you're going to find that these sections of the DNA molecule have a function. A lot of times creation scientists are faulted by evolutionists saying, well, your model has no predictive ability, but it is right here. We predicted, go back and look. And sure enough, as they've done that, they're finding now it's becoming increasingly clear that most or all of the genome is functional. And Jonathan Wells wrote this book, The Myth of Junk DNA, in 2011. And again, that's been confirmed. The ENCODE project was an international research project looking at these segments of the DNA molecule that were said to be left over from evolution, and that they said had no function. They weren't producing proteins, so they thought they had no function. But as they've studied them more, what did they find out? Almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. This metaphor of junk, they say, is not that useful. And it's just plain the key point, they said, it's not junk. And so now we know there's all kinds of functions for this non-protein coding DNA. This came from a list of, I think, 180 something. And repairing DNA was in there, assisting in DNA replication, regulating DNA transcription, aiding in folding of chromosomes, aiding in the maintenance of chromosomes, controlling RNA editing and splicing. That's pretty important, isn't it? Helping to fight disease and regulating embryological development. We got something wrong with that. If we didn't have those portions of the DNA, we'd be in trouble. None of us would be here because we all had to go through that process. And that list of articles is really, really, really long that you can look at. So it's not junk. The human genome on the 20th anniversary, the junk DNA idea hits the trash. And I'm just going to skip a couple there. So junk, we can just say no. What about the idea of imperfection? That's the idea that says, oh, we could do it better. If this was created, we could do it better. I mean, your eye, you know, we might think that it's poorly designed. However, Darwin, when he looked at the eye, he said, to this day, the eye makes me shudder. He knew his theory of evolution by natural selection could not explain complex structures like the human eye. And yet Richard Dawkins says the eye has an absurd design. He thinks it's wired backwards. And he says if it was designed the way he could do it better. It's basically what he's saying. The problem is if the eye was designed the way that Dawkins thinks it should be designed, he'd go outside on a nice sunny day. He'd be blind within a couple of hours because our eyes are designed to filter out a lot of this harmful light that's coming in when it's too much. We have a friend down in Costa Rica. He's an eye surgeon, and he was in one of our training programs. He did a whole presentation just on the cornea of the eye. And then later he put together a program on the design of the eye. He said he could talk for days on just the eye, phenomenal complexity that we see. So what is our explanation then? Well, if it didn't happen by accidents and chance, what's the alternative? That there is a designer, an intelligent designer. Dave's a geologist. He likes to study rocks, but I've been talking to him over the years, and I told him, you know, living things are much more interesting than rocks. And I've got him converted now. He loves design. So he's going to talk to you about some of the evidences of design.
Okay, thank you, Mary Jo. Anyhow, yes, we're going to look at design for a little bit. One of my favorite areas of design happens to be with this butterfly. That butterfly is actually called the blue morpho or the morpho butterfly. And there's one thing I want to point out to you. First of all, the blue morpho butterfly is not blue. Huh? It isn't. It isn't blue. And in fact, if you look at the scales of the blue morpho, or look first of all to the underside, what do you see here? You find out that the blue morpho butterfly basically brown. It has no pigmentation for blue. Interesting, huh? No pigmentation whatsoever. But what you do have are all of these clear scales made out of chitin. It's clear like your fingernail, okay? It's basically what it is. And but those scales are really important because when you look at them, you're looking at all these little ridges in each one of these scales. There are millions of these little ridges called laminae on the wing or in a scale of a butterfly. Now, what does that do? Well, actually, the light comes down into those laminae, and what happens is the blue is selected for, nah, we don't want to say that, but the blue is actually enhanced. It's called constructive interference. So everything else in the spectrum is blocked out. And what do you have? Blue, part of the spectrum, but it is magnified through all of these laminations, magnified. And an airline pilot from 30,000 feet up in the air can see blue morpho butterflies on the ground. Isn't that amazing? And what about those placement of those laminae? Here's one here. The spacing of the laminae must be precisely controlled to a certain fraction of the wavelength, 1/8 of the wavelength. Approximately 1.4 million layers of these laminae are meticulously arranged with incredible accuracy on the wings. What does this say to me? There is an engineer involved, okay? That's evidence of creation when you look at it. But what is a naturalistic explanation say for this? We can imagine how mutations in natural selection acting over millions of years might refine or produce systems. There's a couple of words there that are not too scientific. Imagine and might. Okay, that's the hope of naturalism, isn't it? That's the faith of naturalism. And then I can give you all kinds of evidence, like, for instance, your brain is better than my computer. So if my computer was designed, so was your brain, okay? It's amazing. We can look at a little tiny beetle even, and it has a system, a whole bunch of different things working exactly at the same time to be able to take two chemicals, mix them together in the proper mixing chambers, and then using certain valves, put them into the firing chamber or explosion chamber. And what happens is that little beetle can now shoot a fiery blast into the face of an approaching frog. All right? Everything working at the same time indicates a designed, engineered system. This sort of stuff does not come by accident. All right? And so, but if you are 100% convinced of naturalism, you have two ways of explaining virtually everything somebody might suggest as a design. And number one is naturalistic explanations involve heroes of millions of years, heroes of time, coupled with mutation and selection. What have you been learning already today? Well, first of all, you don't know this yet, but time works against the evolutionary progression. It's more time to have it deteriorate, not get better. And we allow some thinking, okay? We allow thinking here. You can think about it. You don't have to be tied or chained to the idea of naturalism that everything in the universe has to be explained without a God. You don't have to be chained to that, okay? Thinking is allowed, okay? But remember, as we think about it, what did Dr. Sanford say? One of the top genetic researchers in the world, actually. He says, you can confidently reject the idea of mutation in natural selection. All right, that's what he's saying. All right, so we can give you even more evidence of design. I'm going to do it just in the next couple minutes. I'm not going to take very long whatsoever. But think about this evidence of design right here. Think about the DNA and how it codes to be able to get a molecular machine that's going to give you energy, okay? So you can stay awake, okay? But anyhow, according to Dr. Candil, there are over 20,000 types of molecular machines in your cells. In humans alone, 20,000 plus. Now, these are little machines that you can't even see, and you're going to need very sophisticated equipment and scanning electron microscopes, plus all kinds of laboratory work, and you're going to find out they're extremely efficient. All right, here's what Howard Berg from Harvard University says. These are the most efficient machines in the universe. Now look at the end of your finger. The end of your little finger. Do you realize there are more molecular motors and machines at the end of your molecular world? The synthase that's going to make the energy for you. All right, now, first of all, it's made up of 32 specific proteins. Okay, 32 of them. It has two distinct rotary motors. They're turning together, and actually they're grinding. It's like a grinding machine, and it's joined by a stator, just like an electric motor would have. It's powered by protons. It takes a proton in and it makes a chemical reaction. What's going on there? It takes one chemical, ADP, and translates it and changes it to ATP, which is what? Your energy. Okay, that's your energy molecule. And it spins. This motor actually spins 9,000 revolutions per minute. Whoa, that's amazing, isn't it? How can this do it? All right, how can it do it? And how do you get there in the first place? Let me just mention that. First of all, you have your DNA that's going to code for, say, a protein, just say any of the proteins in that machine. So you have to have the DNA there. But the DNA is tightly wound up like a little ball inside of the nucleus, isn't it? And what you're going to have to do is first open up that DNA, unwind it. So there's an unwinding machine, first of all. Then there's got to be something that splits that DNA into two strands. Then what happens is you take a piece of that one strand, but you don't want to take the original. You take a copy of it, right? Oh, don't ever work with the original. Take a copy of it, and then call UPS, take your copy, and bring it over to those little polka dots that you see there on that part of the cell, and it's called the ribosome. The ribosome is made up of over 300 proteins, okay, and others as well. Wow. So it takes proteins to even code for more proteins. Okay, but now what you're going to do is take the computer things, the computer set of instructions from this little piece right here. It's going to code for a specific protein. So what happens is it goes in the ribosome. Now this little ribosome is going to carry out the instructions of the computer, a DNA program. And what's going to happen is out pops this long string of beads, let's say, each bead being a different amino acid. It's a string of beads. And it comes popping out as a nice big long string. Now, some of those strings in your body might be 200 amino acids, the little ones. Some of the big ones might be 4,000. And every one of those amino acids have to be in the right space or place there, right? Whew. Okay, so now what do you have? This thing now manufactures that amino acid bead chain from the instructions, and it's a big, long string here. Now, we're not done yet because it's not really a working protein. It's not going to work yet. So you have to call UPS again to deliver it into a folding machine. Into a folding machine. Then it gets there, it comes out a nice, neat, perfectly folded amino or a protein with all the different color amino acid beads in the same position. Okay, all together. That's an amazing system that's going on here. All right, this is inside the cell that you didn't even, Darwin never knew anything about it, by the way. Okay, but now we're not quite done yet. Now we have to transport, we have to call UPS again and say, please take this package of proteins to various parts of the cell. And sure enough, this is called the kinesin transport machine. It's UPS. It's going to take a bag of proteins, and we didn't know what was going on until we had very sophisticated equipment and techniques. And now, this is the UPS guy. This is the bag of proteins. Now, wait a minute. What's this thing going down? It's like he's walking on a highway. Did you know inside your cells there are highways? They're called microtubules. Okay? And there are highway manufacturing machines that puts this thing together and all the way to where you need to go in the cell, like the position of where that synthase machine will be. Okay, so this guy, he's actually moving along it pretty fast. But you don't understand this in the the cellular world, it's a long ways to go from one part of the cell to another cell when you're so tiny that you can't even see it. And so what happens here? I mean, it's like me running across Minneapolis. But if it at the speed he's going, it's like me running at 1,200 miles per hour. Really trucking here, right? I can't do that. Okay. But anyhow, then what he does is drops his load over here, and it's going to be one or a whole bunch of the proteins necessary in this particular machine. Now, there are deconstruction highway people too, that behind him are taking the highway away. And he goes back by a different route. Interesting. Interesting. My question is this. Does this look like something that just accidents might have produced? No. I think if we allow thinking, okay, if we allow thinking, we're going to see an engineered system, right? Very much engineered. And who's the master engineer of the universe? I believe God, right? It's not just accidents. All right, so that's basically one of the things here. I see design, I don't see imperfection. So it's very important to look at. Well, what answer would an evolutionist provide? Here's the one I get frequently. We can imagine, but there's another one. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Do you understand the being chained to the idea of naturalism? That's what's happening in our classrooms around the world today. Thinking is allowed. We don't have to be chained, do we? And basically, this evolutionary naturalism, keep in mind, is a belief system posing as though it were science. Okay? It's not science in itself. You know, what's the probability of even getting one protein? Okay, it's like this, one chance in number 1 or 10 to the 260th power. That's not very likely. Okay, to give you an idea, let's fill up the entire universe, and you can see that we're talking about a lot of faith. We're going to fill up that entire universe with red marbles. And then we're going to hide a blue marble behind some galaxy out there. And the chance that you could find that one marble accidentally 3 times in a row would be 100 million times easier than making that one simple protein. You understand it's not going to happen? Okay. In the college statistics class that I was teaching, I mentioned this. We calculated these odds. And I said, I don't know what they tell you in biology about these kind of odds, but in statistics, we call that 0. Guess what? 5 minutes later, I heard from the department chairman. I understand you're preaching religion in the classroom. Does that sound like religion, what I just said? I told him I was glad to tell him that, what I told the students. And we calculated it. And he said, I guess that's not religion, but you better drop that, drop this creation, evolution stuff. Okay, I didn't. That's why I can be with you tonight. Okay. Anyhow, so I believe the evidence cries out things were created with a design. They just couldn't happen by accident. Okay. And yeah, our God is our great designer, isn't he? So I see the supposed evidences of evolution. Mary Jo covered the first 4, imperfection. I look out there and I see amazing design. I don't see imperfection at all. I see amazing design. All right, that's very important. But what if Darwin had known about the DNA? What if he knew what was going inside of that cellular city with everything happening? Would he still have believed in evolution? Would he have clung to it? That is a question I don't know. But it's a question we all have to grapple with, isn't it? Yeah. We know about this stuff. Are we going to still cling to naturalism? I don't think so. I think the evidence cries out it was designed. All right. Now, tomorrow night, we're going to talk about the fossil record. Okay? What do fossils say about evolution? Basically nothing, because rocks don't talk. Okay? That's tomorrow night's presentation, same time right here. And then the next night, Friday night, will be geology. What's the hero of the plot? Is it a lot of time or lots of water? Okay, what is it? We're going to be looking at that, and we're going to show you something that you don't get in your geology classes here. All right, so we're going to stop right here, and if you wish to get our publication called Think and Believe, we just want you to sign up for it, okay? Or write me an email at davenutting@discovercreation.org, and we'll get you on there, okay? It's a free newsletter. And by the way, we give tours of different places. Like one big tour that I really love is the tour of Costa Rica. Amazing evidences of design in Costa Rica, including that blue morphle that's not blue. Okay, that's one of the things I love to talk about there. But anyhow, that's February 25 to March 5. And incidentally, I'm going to go a little bit further than what Parnell said. Saturday night, Saturday evening, I'll be talking there at the campus church there where he's pastoring. And guess what I'm going to talk about? Amazing design features specifically found in Costa Rica. Okay, that's the program Saturday night. And I think some of you might really enjoy that. We get tours to Yellowstone as well. We got 3 of them coming up this next summer. And anyhow, so basically, we want you to visit our website. Okay, we have books here too. Amazing books. That'll be really good for the whole family and can open people's eyes. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop here. Parnell's going to come up here. What we normally do is what? How do we do question and answer?
Yeah, so how about a round of applause for Dave and Mary Jo? Yeah, thank you guys very much. So we're going to open it up to a question and answer period. So what we want to do is, if you have comments, that's fine. but we ask that you also have a question for the speakers and keep the comments brief. And when we're done with Q&A, like formally, then we'll, if anyone wants to talk further one-on-one or check things out, we'll hang out in this room for a longer period of time. Sometimes we stay here until they kick us out. So we have this room for another hour and a half. So Q&A probably won't go that long, but if you want to talk, we sometimes end up talking that long. So yeah. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hands.
Hi, I've guys got a couple of related ones. Just the first one is how old? Oh, sorry. You have say. I don't want to interrupt.
Go ahead.
What is the age of the Earth? As far as you know.
I just might. We better use that one. I think that microphone is defunct. Okay, what is the age of the Earth? Okay, how old do you want it to be?
No. It's related to a question. I'm gonna follow
Oh,
up.
no. When people ask me how old the Earth is, I say, how old do you want it to be? And the reason I say that is because I can give you all kinds of different methods for the age of the Earth. And they're all based upon scientific observation, and it's all based upon various aspects. Different methods give different ages. I can give you ages of the Earth in terms of billions of years. By using certain methods, I have some problems with because I've studied into them. And I could give you age anywhere in between from then to even some of the accepted methods when operating on things of known age tell you they haven't happened yet. I mean, that's really tough. But now I believe the Earth is young. Okay.
Oh yeah.
And so go ahead and follow up. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just if you can give me just like your personal, like, you don't need to like.
Okay, here's
Your personal.
thousands of years, not millions of years.
How many? Thousands?
Say
Okay.
thousands. Go ahead now.
Are you
Follow up.
familiar with the heat problem, as it's called? It's related to just the properties of the way radioactive material decays. As it does so, it releases heat, just like small amounts of thermal energy as like the decay occurs.
Yes.
I can pull up the relevant stuff, but the heat problem is if you try to explain the current like ratios of parent to daughter material in like of full radioactive material that we have, like it's the ratios is how radiometric dating works. I presume you have maybe issues with radiometric dating, but if you like the amount of heat that that would be produced, but if you condense that down to thousands of years, that's enough heat to and I have someone here pulled up who has gone through and done the math. It's enough to vaporize the granitic crust of the Earth several dozen times over.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
What assumptions are you using?
They have let me see. I have the website. I can link it to you. But where would you like me to start as far as assumptions?
I mean, what assumptions are they using? Are they basing their findings on?
Would you like me to walk through the math?
No, just the assumptions.
Assumptions behind
They're working on the amount of heat that I'm trying to see. They're using uranium-238. They're going off the amount of heat that the decay of it produces times the mass of the mantle and the crust, thermal conductivity of rocks.
Okay, so my question for you though is, what are the assumptions they're basing it on?
That the properties of the laws of radioactive decay would be consistent with what in history with what we can observe today.
Okay, so that they're constant. The rates of radioactive decay are constant over how many years? Billions?
Well, yes.
Can you prove that?
Specifically that it functions the same in the past as it did now.
Right. How do we know that?
Um,
That it's consistent how would we verify that assumption is valid?
We, the way that we would do it is, we have no reason to assume that it would be different in the past. I have seen no evidence that the laws of radioactive decay have changed at any point. So, I'm confident in assuming that they haven't.
So it sounds to me like we're talking about two different things. The one thing I think you were saying was, I guess the assumption would be a naturalistic assumption that you have to operate under, like, remember when we started out, I was talking about paradigms. So, creation, we believe God created a supernatural paradigm. So to like apply a naturalistic assumptions to a supernatural paradigm is to make an assumption, right? It's to make assumptions.
Sure.
So that's what they're saying. What assumptions are being made? That
Okay.
in order to say things would vaporize, there's assumptions being made, right? Like, so what are those assumptions?
As I became a creationist years ago, based mostly on biological things, by the way, I was also, keep in mind, not only a mathematician, but a geologist. Okay. And so somebody challenged me to look into these radioactive decay dating methods and some of the assumptions that are necessary with the parent, daughter, et cetera, type of materials. And I was challenged to look into that. And at that point, yes, I became a creationist, but I had never considered the age of the Earth as a problem. I always thought, oh yeah, it's millions or billions of years old. I would have just accepted it, and I drug that right along with me into my creationist view until somebody challenged me. And the more I looked into it, I found out that they're, like Mary Jo was talking about, assumptions. Essentially, for radioactive decay dating in general, you end up with literally a page and a half worth of assumptions. Some of those things, as a geologist, I can prove wrong right then. And so why are they even assuming this when I know they're wrong and so many people know they're wrong? Now, one of the things, first of all, when you date something, you are always dating a rock of unknown age, right? So how do you know if you're right or wrong? You don't. Okay. The only way to tell is to date a rock of known age. And that has been done a whole bunch of different times. And what they have found out, like for instance, when Mount St. Helens erupted, the recent volcanic lava came up, and it turned out that they dated that. And it turned out instead of 30 years like they would have expected yet, it would have been 340,000 years up to 2.8. Just a minute here. Okay, up to 2.8 million years. Okay, I said something was wrong. Same thing happened in New Zealand. Same thing happened with recent volcanic lava flows in Hawaii. The dates were even broader there, that went up all the way up to 1 billion years. And it was just, they knew when it occurred. And so those are rocks we would know the age of, and we're getting horrible results. And so we have to take that into consideration. Now, as far as that, what you were suggesting as far as the heat aspect, do you realize the very same things that will produce an element like a radioactive decay element can produce a whole suite of elements? And what we call daughter products today may not have been daughter products. Okay, they have been part of the whole creation. And another thing, like lead 204, a lot of people don't realize it, but you can get lead 206 as part of this quote daughter product and all this. Do you realize lead 206 can actually be produced by bombardment on lead 204? Okay, and bombardment of neutrino bombardment, and you can actually go that direction just by that one little thing. And so when I look at the assumptions, and I have seen many of these type of articles like you were talking about. I'm not sure of that specific one, but yeah, on that website, but frequently they go back to a whole bunch of different ones. And there are a lot of assumptions there that I, as a geologist, can't handle. I can't accept that because I have studied too much of it. All right.
Send us the reference.
Yeah, I'd love to
Yes.
do that.
Yeah.
And if you'd send it to me, also include your email and I can correspond back to you.
Dave Nutting at Discover Creation.
Sure. I wanted to say about the Mount St. Helens material is too young to be able to do radiometric dating. However, the Pompeii eruption is old enough, a few thousand years, for enough data material to have decayed, and they've dated the Pompeii rocks and got pristine dates.
How old does it have to be?
I think I'm looking at about 2,000 years, and then after that you get, I want to say pristine dates, like corroborated with like contemporary historical accounts of the Pompeii thing that were happening around the same time as then they tested the Pompeii material and got corroborated.
Yeah, we've heard that oftentimes that you can't date something that's recent because you get horrible results.
But then what about?
Now, to me, if they give me horrible results on rocks of known age, how do I rely on them to give you accurate results on rocks of unknown age? And yeah, that's what we hear all the time. But I mean, the only way to test it is the way I suggested. And what they're saying, oh, they'll throw that one out because it doesn't work on recent events. I had a geologist ranger at the Grand Canyon tell me that too. And anyhow, he was given a lecture of radioactive decay, and somebody asked him, how do you know how old these rocks are in this Grand Canyon? He said, well, all of them have been dated by radioactive decay dating methods, and these are very accurate. I had him enter in there at that point when I was in his lecture. I said, sir, are you aware that there isn't a single layer from the top to the bottom virtually, at least to the inner gorge, there's not one layer that you can date by radioactive decay dating methods, because these rocks in these layers contain the wrong type of material. And he thought about it. He was a geologist too. He says, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, you're right. And but all the way through, it's just a matter of we sometimes accept some things that the experts did, and they say this, so we accept it. I used to do that until I realized that sometimes the experts were leading me astray, and I had to do my own research, and even on the radioactive decay dating method until I started doing my own research into it.
You'll talk more about that Friday.
Yeah, I'm barely going to scratch the surface on it on Friday, but I will mention radioactive decay dating because you can't date the rocks. Yes, you can date the layers underneath. Yes, you can date Vulcan's throne, which happens to be, this one should work because it's supposed to be very old. It's more than 2,000 years old, according to your, there's a Vulcan's throne at the top of the Grand Canyon, okay? And the Vulcan's throne had a recent volcanic lava flow that flowed down into the canyon at one time. And so they would expect to get, when I say
Too. And so, yeah, we're looking, there's all, what?
That's a lot of mumbo jumbo.
A lot of mumbo jumbo. Well, you know, the guy, Linnaeus, who came up with that first classification system was, a lot of people think he was a creationist, you know? And so he did it based on observation. And since then, what's happened now is he was basing it more on morphological or function, the structural similarities when he came